Hello, everybody. I'll be talking about the rabies virus. I'll be explaining how it came to be, its functions, and just like symptoms and treatments for it. So, the formal name for this is the rabies virus. And I heard that the lysa is actually a Greek word for rage. And rage is that you'll see that rage is one of the symptoms of rabies, especially for furious rabies. And an alternative name, or the more common name people call it by, is just rabies. Its family is the Rhabdoviridae, and there actually are multiple strains because they depend on the different kind of animal species throughout the world. For example, there's like a rabies virus Ontario fox, there's like a rabies virus Ontario skunk. So yeah, it can just be named after like a specific animal so you'll know which animal rabies virus came from. So there is a nickname you might have heard when you think of rabies. It's called mad dog disease. And in some place rabies is called this because the due to like the transmission that's typically being from infected dogs, because dogs is actually one of the most common, probably the most common animal that's a victim of rabies other than raccoons and stuff. So here's a taxonomy for this. I can't really pronounce most of these names anyway, but I found it really interesting that for viruses at least, taxonomy, it starts off at the realm level, which is the Rabies. And yeah, here's the family, the Rhabdoviridae, genus Lysovirus, and the species as the Lysovirus rabies. It's also important to note that there is a subfamily called the Alpha-Rhabdovirinae, and this was only distinguished back in 2020 according to ICTV's taxonomy database. Okay, so looking at the history of rabies now, you can look all the way back into the around the first century AD. I think it was like around 25 to 50 AD. This guy, he's a Roman scholar named Celsus, and he was the one that actually pointed saliva to being the cause for rabies. And so he was right on that part that the saliva actually contained the virus. But the part where he went wrong and like horribly wrong was he thought a treatment for rabies was to like dunk the patient's head underwater, so basically drowning them. And if they somehow survive, then he basically treated them. 'Cause that means they don't have rabies anymore. Yeah, don't really know how that worked out. I really doubt anybody survived because he's literally drowning them. And this especially sucks because hydrophobia is literally one of the symptoms for rabies. So yeah, so glad we don't do that anymore. But to find the actual first vaccine for rabies, you can look at Louis Pasteur. If you guys remember, he's the one that created pasteurization. So he did this in 1885. He created the first vaccine for rabies, and he tested it on a boy that was bitten by a rabid dog like 15 times, and yeah, it was successful. So you can thank him and not this guy. Okay, so now look at the characteristics to understand what exactly is rabies. So rabies, it's a virus, and the causative agent is known as RAV, which is literally just called rabies virus. So rabies virus, it's a negative stranded RNA virus, and it's under the genus Lysovirus and the family Rhabdoviridae, like we already went over. I got a picture here if you want to see a more closer detail. So the rabies virus, as you can see, contains there's 5 different structural proteins. There's the nucleoprotein, there's the phosphoprotein down here, and this is the matrix protein and the glycoprotein, and this one is just the RNA directed RNA polymerase. So each one has obviously its different functions. For example, like the nucleoprotein, this encapsulates the RNA genome to creating a ribonucleoprotein. And then the ribonucleoprotein is then condensed with the phosphoprotein and the RNA directed RNA polymerase, which and it makes this like helical shaped nucleocapsid. And then this matrix protein would form the bridge between this nucleocapsid and the viral envelope over here. So it just connects them. And it does that by like surrounding the nucleocapsid. And then finally, the last structural protein, the glycoprotein, This is the only one out of the five structural proteins that's actually exposed. Like it's like those green little hairs that's exposed on the surface of the envelope, and so this will act as the ligand for the cell receptor. And I'll be talking about the glycoprotein more in the next upcoming slides because it's used for the process of actually entering like the body. So there's notable strains. I looked it up, and there was about 10 total rabies viruses, but only two of them were pathogenic. And this is like the rabies lysovirus and the Australian bat lysovirus. So the Australian virus, it's like more specific. It's obviously in Australia, and it has to do with like a bat, pretty much. And then the rabies lysovirus is the more common one. It's more broad because it occurs in every continent except for Antarctica, obviously. And so yeah, this is the virus we'll be talking about more. So how this starts? So the beginning, it always begins from an animal scratch or bite because it's in the saliva, and so when the animal bites, obviously the saliva will enter your body. And for the scratch, animal saliva is usually sometimes in on like the claws of the animal. So when they scratch you, you can reveal the saliva to the muscle tissue. So the muscle tissue is basically the beginning part that receives the saliva. So once it reaches your muscle tissue, it there's two possible mechanisms that it can take of the neuroinvasive strategy. The first method is the rabies virus, the glycoprotein, the thing I was talking about earlier, the only one that's exposed on the envelope. This will interact the nicotinic acetylcholine receptor in order to allow entry into the muscle cells. And then the replication of the virus here will occur before the budding process into the neuromuscular junction. So that's one of the processes. And the second or another process you could take is it's also using the glycoprotein, and the glycoprotein will interact with many of the cell receptors on the neuron. So this will allow for direct entry into the neuron. So it doesn't need to do all that extra replication in the muscle. So you can just skip the neuromuscular junction and just go straight into the neuron. I have some pictures on the next slide to like so you can actually understand what I'm trying to say here. So, but anyways, after that though, the virus will travel through the peripheral nervous system into the central nervous system, where viral replication would increase. So during this part, so from the peripheral nervous system into central nervous system, well, as it's traveling, you might feel like you have no symptoms. You might feel normal, so that's why it can be really dangerous. So if you do get bit by an animal, always go to the hospital because this is when it's just traveling, so you won't feel any symptoms. But yeah, after all the symptoms, there's like a big gap between these 2 points. But the virus would then travel back down the peripheral nervous system to many tissues, like the salivary glands, to be able to infect a new host. So, for example, the salivary glands will produce the saliva that contains the virus. That's why you can see like for example, like the rabies animals, they have like foaming in their mouth. It's because the virus is trying to spread out, and the saliva is coming out of their mouth, so they're trying to infect a new host. Yeah, so here's the picture that I was talking about. A is like the first method I was talking about where the glycoprotein would bind to the nicotinic acetylcholine receptor over here in the muscle cell, and then it would amplify or replicate down here, and then it will go to the neuron. Or B, which is the second method where it can just go directly into the neuron. As you can see, the glycoprotein is connecting to the receptors of the neuron, so it doesn't have to go through this neuromuscular junction at all, and it will just replicate. So this is the neuron for the peripheral nervous system, and then it would just start the replication after it passes the peripheral nervous system into the central nervous system. So now looking on actual stats of incidence and prevalence in based on the United States and globally, and this is all according to the CDC. So in the United States, rabies is not as common compared to global, where there's more like stray animals roaming the streets. But in the United States, according to the CDC, there's about 4,000 rabies cases, and there's only like less than 10 deaths a year. So it's not very common here. But compared to globally, I couldn't find any of like how many cases there are yearly, just because there's so many. It's like, and it's due to underreporting and there's just uncertain estimates. But according to the CDC, there's about 70,000 deaths globally to rabies. And although rabies it's not the leading case of death anywhere, according to the World Health Organization, about 95% of cases and deaths occur in Asia and Africa. So this ties back to what I was saying before, how back in Asia and Africa, there's just way more stray animals in the streets and just a lot more people, so it's hard to keep track of how many cases there are. Because some people just don't even go to the hospital, so you'll never know if they even had rabies or not. Okay, so now looking at the symptoms of rabies, there's this incubation period, and so this is the period that occurs before the virus reaches your brain or the central nervous, and that's needed for the symptoms. This is like what I was talking about before, when it's moving from your peripheral nervous system to your central nervous system. You want to feel any symptoms to feel normal. So the first stage of symptoms, like when you get bit, you'll feel pain, discomfort, and itching at the site of the infection, and then this will eventually lead to like fever-like symptoms because your body is trying to like fight the virus, the immune response. And the second stage is called the neurological phase. This is when you feel anxiety, paralysis, and hydrophobia. Hydrophobia is when you're scared of water, and this usually occurs because you'll feel muscle spasms even when you think of water. So you can't drink water, you can't swallow, and you'll even feel delirium, convulsions, and like hallucinations and stuff. Usually, when you have these symptoms, it's usually 100% fatality rate. So if you do get bit, just make sure you go to the hospital like right away. So all of these would usually lead to a coma, but most likely death. And there are two kinds of symptom progressions: furious and paralytic rabies. If this dog is furious rabies, it's the more common one. All the other symptoms occur first, then paralysis occurs. So the furious one, the virus is trying to make the host like angry or like aggressive to attack another person so that they get the virus. And then there's a paralytic rabies. So in this one, paralysis occurs first at the site of exposure. So for example, if you get bit on your hand will be paralyzed first, and the paralysis would slowly move from your hand to the rest of your body. And then once it gets to the brain, it would lead to a coma, which then will lead to death. So both of these lead to death anyway. So to prevent this, there's two things you could do. You could take a rabies pre-exposure prophylaxis. This is a vaccine, say a series of rabies vaccines that's given to those who could come in contact. So if you know you could come in contact with an animal that has rabies, make sure you take the PEP. And there are recommendations on how you can take the dosage by the advisory committee on immunization practices. And then if you did get bit, you should take the rabies post-exposure prophylaxis. And this is used when you're exposed to the rabies virus. And there's more steps in this, like proper wound washing first, and the second, the administration of a rabies vaccine. I'll be explaining more on that. So on a continued, for the post-exposure prophylaxis, you need to make sure you take the human rabies immune globulin first, because it's part of it, and you got to make sure that you only take this if you've never received like a pre-exposure prophylaxis before. So what this is a picture of it right here. What this basically does is it provides your body with like immediate antibodies until you take the actual rabies vaccine, so that your body can make its own antibodies, but it'll always have those immediate antibodies right away. So looking at the future outlook of rabies, according to the National Institutes of Health, the hopes of minimizing deaths of rabies all rely on the pre and post exposure prophylaxis. So the PEP, it's limited to a few hospitals in Africa, and it's really expensive for people in Africa. So if you want to like minimize rabies, what they really want to do is being able to conserve PEP through the use of intradermal administration. So this only uses up like 50% of a vial. So the country of Madagascar uses this, and it works because two people can use like one vial and save PEP for everybody else. So yeah, this is the only future outlook there is, just to save the actual vaccine. And yeah, so that's my presentation. Thanks for watching.